Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Hi. You guys having a good time at MIX? Awesome. It's not raining, that's all I got to say. I'm just happy because I look outside and there's sun. It's very exciting because I live in Seattle. I want to do a quick check before I start. Can I get a show of hands for folks who are in the room who support developers, who are really on the administration IT pro side and they support developers? Okay, so I'm assuming that the rest of you folks are developers. Okay, great. So let me see. Let me ask another question. How many of you folks in the room write code once and it always works all the time, everywhere? Works in... Excellent! I like that. Come find me afterwards. I got a job for you. So the rest of us, speaking for myself at least, the rest of us, when we write code, it mostly works in development. We get it to a good point. We put it into production. We're constantly tweaking it. We're fixing it in the development process. We're fixing it in production. And one of the things that we've done in the IIS7 release is that we built a lot of diagnostic tools in the box for you to take advantage of without having to go to any sort of outside third-party tools to do that diagnostic work in a faster, more productive way. So it's really relevant for developers, and one of the things that I've tried to do in this talk is really focus on the developer lifecycle, which is at what point in the developer lifecycle would you really want to use one or another tool, and make that relevant to you in your day-to-day operation. My name is Mylon Thompson-Bukovac. I'm the Group Program Manager for IIS, and what I'm going to do today is I'm really going to focus on a couple things. One is, in every talk that we give in IIS, I really like us to focus on best practices. So you can read a lot of books, you can look at articles. Really what we try to do in these presentations is give you the synopsis of what you really should be doing from a best practice or pattern perspective. I'll go into the diagnostics work in some detail that we've done for the IIS7 platform. But to start it all off, I wanted to give you some context on IIS7. So let me get a show of hands for folks who are pretty familiar with the new feature set for IIS7. Okay, a little less than half the crowd. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the top 5 things that I really love about IIS7. And I'll talk a little bit about why I in particular love these things. I mean, you have your own list, I'm sure, if you're familiar with IIS7. And as you start to work with it, your list will probably grow. I had a really tough time keeping it down to 5. But the top reason for me to love IIS7 is really the new architecture. It's the way that we've taken what was a monolithic web server before, and we've broken it down to individual modules that can be scaled down to meet your business requirements, your performance needs, your customization requirements as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that next. I also think that the PHP hosting that we've done in this release is pretty profound. How many folks went to the PHP talk this morning for IIS? Okay, just one. So we provide first-class PHP hosting in IIS7. And I couldn't really say that for IIS6. PHP applications run in IIS6, but they run slowly and not in a very performant way. We have a new module in IIS7 called FastCGI that changes all that. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I have a bunch of PHP demos to show you as well. And then we have this easy-to-use XML-based configuration system. So this is a really powerful major architectural improvement that we've done to move away from the metabase, which was a source of a lot of complaints and concerns from customers, and to something that's very transparent about what the configuration is. So you can change it very easily. You can look things up very easily. With great power comes great responsibility, if I can quote Spider-Man on this one. And one of the things that I'll do as I talk through this is some tips to make sure that you don't hang yourself on what's essentially a text-based configuration system. The secure remote and delegated administration feature that we have is also, it's a major one for you as developers. What it means is that your IT professionals can delegate control over certain parts of the application to you. So a common example or scenario of this is default document. Your IT administrator who has control over a production server can delegate control of default document for a particular website to a remote developer. And they can work on that default document, edit it, change it, and not have to keep on going back to that IT professional to get that permission. And then, of course, the diagnostic tools that we have here. They're proving incredibly popular, and they're proving popular just about with every type of customer we talk about, because the type of folks who use it really do range from developers to IT administrators. So let's start off by going into IIS-7 modularity. So what we did at the beginning of the IIS-7 project is that we took all the core functionality of the web server and we ported it to modules. So we have about 40 different modules that we ported it to, and the implications for you as developers are really in two ways. One is you can replace any of these modules with one of your own. So if you don't like our ODBC logging module, you can uninstall it and replace it with your own. So you can customize whatever configuration of web server that you have. The second thing that I think is really interesting about it is that when you add functionality into IIS now, it integrates seamlessly into the actual platform that we provide, whether that's UI or diagnostic tools. So for example, I was just talking to some folks before the talk. We built a FTP, a secure FTP server on this new extensibility module. And it's downloadable today from IIS.net, fully supported by Microsoft. And when you install it, you can manage it through IIS Manager. And you can use the same diagnostic tools that I'm going to go through today to diagnose problems with it. So when you plug in to the platform, you plug into all the functionality in the platform. And both of those things, the ability to customize what you have and then the ability to extend it yet still take advantage of the core platform features, are really a fundamental shift and change that we've made. And it's a really exciting direction for us on the IIS product team to have gone in. Now, PHP support is something I always like to talk about because of the scenario it creates where you can have a single Windows Server 2008 server that's hosting ASP.NET and PHP applications alongside. So what we've done is really two things. One is we've partnered with Zen Technologies to improve the PHP engine for running on Windows. And this is a really necessary piece. We had to make some improvements to PHP, the engine, so that it just generally ran well on Windows. The second thing we did is we built this fast CGI module. And the fast CGI module basically enables any application framework that's fast CGI compliant, that's Ruby on Rails, that's Perl, that's PHP, to run in a secure and reliable way on IIS alongside ASP.NET applications. So there's a couple of things I always like to call out here. One is to go back to that ability to plug into the platform. You can use the diagnostic tools that I talk about today with your PHP applications. We'll be able to track requests before it goes into the FastCGI module and after it comes out. We don't really track what's going on inside the FastCGI module because of the PHP engine there. But you are able to plug in and use these platform tools. The other example of how you can use a platform feature with a PHP application is, and there's actually a very good drill down on this in an MSDN journal from, I think, the January edition, where you can take a PHP application, you can run it in what we call integrated mode in IIS, which basically takes a lot of core ASP.NET functionality like forms auth and plugs it into the pipeline so that a PHP application can take advantage of that functionality without writing much code. So, again, the same concept of opening up the platform, having a modular infrastructure, being able to plug in yet take advantage of all the underlying pieces is a major theme in the IIS-7 release. The config system. So it's XML-based. It's very powerful. It basically is the foundation for enabling an Xcopy environment. So if you can Xcopy an application, and I'll show you this later in one of my demos, you can just Xcopy an application from one share into IIS and just have that work without having to export it to XML and all the other stuff you had to do with IIS-6. It drastically reduces your ability to move from server to server. It also opens up things like letting us have a UNC shared configuration story where you can have a UNC share that you share configuration for a set of front ends. You can't really get that unless you have this distributed XML story. We have a couple of things that I always like to talk about with that, though, is because it's text-based, you can go in very easily and make changes into application host.config. I've done this countless times. Many others in the teams have done this too. And you can get in trouble. You can get in trouble because you go and you edit the configuration system, and it's part of the configuration. So I'll talk a little bit more as we go through this about what tricks that you can do to make sure that you don't run into any problems and can leverage the full power of the configuration system without getting into a bad state. So remote admin and delegation, this is something that's really appealed to developers in particular because it lets, to IT administrators as well as developers. IT administrators like it because they can delegate very specific functionality at an application level to developers to just handle. And developers like it because they don't have to go and bug the IT administrators to get access to certain parts of the application. So we've built this in a way that is firewall friendly, it's secure, we go over HTTPS, and we can authenticate with both Windows and non-Windows credentials. So the non-Windows credentials that we use are IIS Manager credentials. There's no association with Windows credentials there, but it's really useful in a shared hosting context where maybe you have customers and you don't want to create a Windows account for your customers. IIS Manager or IIS users are going to be your answer to that. So I'm going to just pop into IIS right now and just give you a brief tour. So this is going to be a couple of concepts that I want to illustrate. The first one is really around the modularity of the web server. So I'm looking right now at the IIS Manager. And as you can see, this is not your familiar snap-in. You have the same sort of tree view hierarchy to the left, but this is really the new feature set. So we're organizing by feature here. And then what we do is we make all of these actions context sensitive. So what I want to do, what I want to show you today is our list of modules that we have installed here. So these are all the different modules. You can look at it by module type. You can organize it by entry type. What's kind of interesting to note about this is that these are all native modules that are grouped together. How many of you folks are familiar with Server Core? Okay, a few folks. So Server Core is it's an install option on Windows Server 2008. It's a very stripped down, lightweight, just a few optional roles, drastically reduced surface of attack and surface of maintenance. It does not run the CLR today. It will in the future in the next release of Windows Server, but it doesn't today. So when IIS is an optional role on it, and when you install IIS on it, you can use it as a classic ASP server, very secure, very fast ASP server or PHP server. And all of these modules that you see here listed under native will run on it. There's only a handful of modules that will not, but all of these will run on a Server Core installation. So we also have, so here you have your modules installed, and I wanted to quickly show you a configuration file. So if you go into your inet serve directory, there's a configuration directory that has all of your server configuration files. Your application host.config file is the one that has your server settings or your global settings for the server. And as you can see, there's all of the things are listed in self-describing order. I'm going to go down to the modules section, because the module section is what's going to correspond to what you see in the UI. Okay, so all your modules are listed over here. Same thing as the modules listed over here. Now, I prefer, personally, to go through IIS tools to modify configuration. We do have people on our team that are just hardcore application host.config editors. They go into Notepad, they make all their changes. I don't, because from my experience, you can get into problems pretty quickly that way. If you stick with the tools that we have, which are app command, which is a command line utility that we shipped in IIS7, and this IIS Manager, you're always going to enforce editing your configuration in the right way. Just to be safe, though, what I always recommend people do before they start messing around with their configuration is they go into their root directory and they, let's see. What's that? Did I miss that? Oh, no, I didn't mean root directory. I misspoke. I meant they are going to go into their inet serve directory, and then there's a tool called app command in there. So app command is a pretty handy little tool, and it's a command line tool that we've shipped. It has a bunch of different object types. It's pretty easy to use. It has this help switch that is always handy when you forget your syntax. But basically what you can do is you can do app command In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up my configuration files. Before I do anything, I'm going to back up my configuration files just in case I get into a bad state. So you start with your verb, you state what your object is, which is backup, and then you say the name. And it's gone ahead and backed up all my config files. So I can go make any changes I want right now, and if I want to, I can just as easily go back into app command and restore that configuration file. I have used that so many times to get myself out of a state that I got myself into when I was debugging or trying to make something work. So let's go through, now we've done that, and remove a module from here. I'm going to remove, let's see, let's do server-side includes. I think I took that one out. Okay, so I'm going to remove the static file module, and it's as simple as just clicking remove. So a couple things to note. I just unloaded it from the IIS process. It is still installed on the box. Okay? So that means if it's still installed on the box, it's still going to get patched, it's still going to get updated. But it's been uninstalled or unloaded from the IIS process, reducing the footprint and all of that. If you want to uninstall it from the box and just take it off the box entirely, you have to go through Server Manager. Okay? Server Manager is basically the face of Windows Server setup. And if you take it off the box with Server Manager, then it's taken off the box entirely. So now what I want to do is I want to go back to application host. And take a look. We'll go back to our module section. Okay. And you'll see it's been taken off the module list. Now, bringing a module back is fairly simple as well. All you have to do is configure native modules, and there's my server-side include. I must have taken it off before. You select the ones that you want. You just add them back in, and I won't show you, but basically, if you go back to application host config, then you'll see it again. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to quickly show you was just this X-copy scenario, which is a pretty powerful one. So if I go to my, my desktop, I have a very simple demo file that I'm just going to grab. Hold on. And I'm going to take it over to inetpub root. I'm going to create a website or a folder for it. And I'm going to drop those files in. Now, this is a pretty simple application. Very simple web config file. This is the application-specific configuration file. So a web.config in IIS, the big difference between IIS6 and IIS7 for the web.config file is that the combined ASP.NET as well as IIS settings will now live in web.config. And it'll travel around with the application when you Xcopy it around. So going back to here, I'm going to go take a look at my sites and open that up. You can refresh it if you're not seeing it. And then you have your demo 1. I'm just going to convert to application. And then it's going to display the standard opening graphic for IIS7. So it's as simple as that. That process maybe took 30 seconds. And really, that kind of scenario is enabled with the new configuration system. So let's talk a little bit about diagnostics. So there's a couple things to note about diagnostics. The main thing I wanted to point out is that there's a bunch of different ways that you consume the diagnostic information. You'll consume it in IIS Manager, and I'll show you a bunch of demos where we actually go to IIS Manager and we view requests in flight. We set up rules for a failed request tracing. You also use the browser quite frequently. So detailed errors is an incredibly useful, very valuable feature, and it's all consumed in the browser. You also look in the browser for your failed request logs. We have an XSLT that makes it look nice and is very human readable. You have the event monitor, of course. You've got app command. And app command will do a couple things. It'll help you set configuration. It'll also help you review and look at, for example, requests in flight. So that top layer of tools are all different ways you're going to consume this diagnostic information, and they're all provided in the box. So these are not things that you have to go out and buy or get. It's included with IAS 7. From a platform perspective, we actually have quite a wide variety of different tools. And what I'll talk about in the next slide is really about when you're going to use each one and what context of your development life cycle. Really, the two that I call out and I'll spend the most time on today are detailed errors and failed request tracing. We do support ETW tracing, which is a Windows-based tracing system. I personally think it's useful without being wildly usable. It logs a lot of data, and you have to use log parser to really get at it. So I tend not to emphasize that. It can be useful if you're trying to debug very complex situations, but I really depend on detailed errors and failed request tracing for the most part. We do have an integration with ASP.NET Trace, as well as System.Diagnostics, and I'll have a demo of that. We have new performance counters. This is very useful in a production setting, and something called RISCA, which is really around looking at requests in real time in flight and seeing what's going on with them. There's also something that's actually fairly not well known, as far as I know, around process orphaning. So you can actually set up in IIS a way that if you have a failed process, you can make sure that you can attach a debugger to that failed process. It doesn't just die. You can keep it alive, and you can attach a debugger to it to really figure out what's going on with it. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to set that up. It's a bit buried, but I wanted to call that out because that's another really useful tip for developers in particular in functional testing. So let's talk about the dev life cycle. In the development phase, you're really looking at, quick and dirty, what are my detailed errors? Am I getting a 404, right? You're looking at failed request tracing. Failed request tracing is something that you can turn on and just leave on. The performance overhead is minimal for this. And it's hugely valuable. It helps you repro, hard to repro bugs. It helps you track down hangs and things like that. Very, very valuable. And then, of course, the ASP.NET Trace integration. From a functional test perspective, you start to layer on functionality from there. You start to say, okay, I can use WCAT. How many of you folks even know about WCAT? Okay, so WCAT was in the IIS-6 resource kit. We've also shipped it on on the IIS.NET website. You can download it and run it. It's basically a stress tool, and I'm going to use it here. I'm going to run some scripts through it that let you as a developer stress your local website and make sure that your performance and your scalability is right before you send it out to a staging or a production server. And then the orphan failed process for debugging that I talked about. And when you're in the production realm, you're looking at a lot of different options. I've talked about several of these already. The debug diag is something that our customer support folks really find very useful as well, and that's available on IIS.NET for download. One of the things that I did to prepare for this talk is I went to go talk to our IIS customer support folks, because all they do day in and day out is they help developers, right? They help developers figure out what's wrong with their applications. So I said I was going to come down to MIX, I was going to talk to a bunch of developers, tell me what tools you use, because you're over the phone even, right, to figure out what's going on with a developer's website. And they were the ones who helped put together this map for when you're in this stage, these are the tools that you really want to depend on. I also have some best practices that they've put together for their own use that I was going to share with you later on in the presentation, because I think it's pretty valuable. This is the advice that I was talking about. Some of it is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's one of those, you look at it and you go, of course, but when you're in the middle of debugging, you're just trying to get it to work. This is like me last night with some of my demos. You can lose track of this, okay? So the first thing is don't assume what's happening. Don't assume something is happening. Go get the facts. And if you think about all the tools that I'm showing you, they're all about getting the facts. They're about having visibility into the request pipeline and looking to see what's wrong and getting data back to feed the diagnostic process. And then, this is something that they say they see all the time. Don't go down switch the setting and see. They see this, people go in and they start turning knobs and flipping switches and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And nothing happens, and they often get into a worse state. So really, it's about finding the root cause. Failed request tracing is all about finding the root cause. And we'll go through that process with the PHP application in the next demo. And then you resolve the problem once you figure out where the root cause is. So isolation of the problem is just a fundamental principle that our customer support folks feel is something that you should think about every time you sit down in the debugging process. Just isolate the problem, figure out the root cause, work on it from there, and use the tools that we're going to talk about today to make that process faster and easier to do. So let's get to the top 3 diagnostic tools. This is my choice, too. I mean, there's all sorts of diagnostic tools. Like I said, there's ETW out there. But these are the top 3 that I think are the most useful and the most used by our customers today. And it's what the support folks in IIS agree with. So the first one is detailed error messages. So simple, but so useful. Basically, it's only going to be on your local host, on your local machine. You will get detailed error messages that your end customer of the application will never see that will help winnow down where the problem is. Failed request tracing is an even more powerful tool. So let's say that you think that something's going wrong with one of your modules. You can set up a rule or a set of rules. You can get these log files that tell you exactly where in the process pipeline a particular module failed or had problems. It's incredibly valuable. And then the tracing integration, which is just making sure that you can work with the tracing infrastructures that we have with ASP.NET and the CLR. So detailed errors. Most of the IIS 7 web server and module conditions are identified in our detailed errors. It's really rich information. I have somebody on my team, her name is Faith. She has a blog up on IIS.NET. And she was the operations manager for WinISP, which is the Microsoft internal hosting platform. It's got about 5,000 sites on it, I think. It's just internal employees, in their own sites, right? And when she was the operations manager, she's now on the product team, she actually wrote all of these detailed errors. Okay? And she wrote them with herself in mind. She wrote them in something's just gone wrong. I got to call a developer and tell them that something's got wrong. What kind of information can I give that person? So as we go through this and you see the detailed errors, you'll see how much information is there and also how useful that is. And it's because somebody, we were thinking about you in the process of what you go through when we wrote that. So let me just talk about the top 3 of these detailed errors that come up quite a bit. 500, it's just something's wrong with your config. It's as simple as that. This is one that you're going to see all the time. Something's gone wrong with your config. It's going to tell you where in your config you have to go look for it. And then the other one is 404, which is you're actually requesting a script that you haven't installed the application framework for. So for example, if I X-copied QDig over to my server, but I didn't enable fast CGI on my server, I wouldn't have the application framework installed. I'd get a 404. Okay? Or you're requesting a static file that hasn't been properly registered as a MIME type. That's another case. So that one happens quite a bit. We get a 404.1 error when you don't have the right configuration authentication setup. So the browser doesn't support, you've done some special authentication type that the browser doesn't support. You're going to get this error for that. Now let me go through and do a quick demo of this. I have a demo. I have a website that has. Actually, I'm gonna see if you catch it, because detailed error. Okay. So I have a problem, right? I got to this website. I get this error. It's a 500.19 internal server error, or server error. It says what the module is. It's a core web server module. Talks about what the requested URL was. Talks about the physical path. Hugely useful, right? So I can just use that to go find my file. Okay, so who sees where the problem is? Yep, in the back. Yeah. Okay, so how many of you guys put typos into your code? How many? I do. I type fast. I put typos all over the place. This is a pretty common thing. You'll see, it's malformed XML because you have a typo. It's nothing that you actually wrote for functionality, but you made a mistake. You have a typo. So what I would do in this case is that I would go and actually, let me go through my prompt. I'd go find my web.config file, fix my typo. This might, yep, and then it fixes the problem. Now another common error that you're going to see is where the file resource not found. That's a fun one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to delete everything from here. Say something bad happened and all my files went away. It's cached. And I get the 403.14 forbidden error. So this basically says that there's two things that it says. One is that the default document is not configured, right? So I could go check the default document and see if it's in fact configured. In this case, my default document, I believe, is just default.aspx. So I would just go in here. I would make sure that my default document is in fact configured, okay? And then if it is, then I go to the next thing, which is directory browser is not enabled in the server. It's a security thing. Basically means I have nothing there at the server. So you can create a lot of different error conditions and come up with these different detailed errors, but fundamentally what you're going to get is the same kind of information. It's going to tell you where the physical address is. It's going to tell you what the URL requested was, and it's going to pinpoint, as far as it can tell, what file and where in the file there was a problem. Okay? So again, I never like to sell detailed errors as something that's just going to solve your problem, but it's really going to narrow down and help isolate where your issue is. It's yeah. Yeah, so the question was, it's a great question, is this only on localhost, right? Can you make it accessible to a developer who is working remotely? The answer is, it is only on localhost. If you turn it on for remote, you would turn it on for everybody, and that's not recommended from a security perspective. We have heard requests from folks that developers want to be able to see this in a remote development scenario, and we're taking a look at that and seeing if it's something we can do in the next release, but for now, it's localhost only. The customers will only see, the standard errors.
Is it logged somewhere that we're developing through it?
Pardon me?
Is it logged?
The question is it logged? And the answer is no. I mean, it's logged as part of the IIS logs, right? But there's not a special dedicated log for it. All right, failed request tracing. This is probably my favorite feature for diagnostics. So this is really about errors that you come across, your customers come across, for application and that you can't repro. That you hear about, somebody calls in, they talk about it, you just can't repro it. It's some hang error, it's something that you just can't figure out. If you have the failed request tracing rules set up, and you're able to just start logging, feedback around this, you're going to be able to really fine-tune. You're going to be able to repro, figure out where your error is occurring, and be able to figure out, basically go through the diagnostic process faster. So the common thing that we see is that the request is taking too long, right? That's a pretty common thing. We have a methodology that you can follow. You can go straight to failed request tracing. You can start with the risk of functionality that I'll go through next. But this is probably the most powerful thing because it lets you set a per URL trace rules, right, which are very specific. It lets you capture all that information about the failed requests, not all the requests, but the fails requests. It persists it to a log that is human readable and quite usable, right? And then it gives you the information, the specific information about where things bombed out in the request pipeline for you to actually take action on. So it's really a pretty powerful feature when you put it all together. I always like to show this feature. It's much more interesting when you show it. Okay, so I'm going to browse to a website now. It's actually a QDig website. It's a PHP application. And it's one that was put together by somebody on my team named Thomas Demmel. And Thomas is a very outdoorsy kind of guy. I mean, this is a guy that sends out the mail that asks people if they want to go climb Mount Rainier in 3 months. Okay, so what he did is he put together a QDig site that had a bunch of photos of him taking the IIS disk, the IIS-7 disk, to all the different places that he goes in his spare time. So it's up on the mountains, it's on a canoe trip. It's a fun little site, but he put some things in it that make it, as you can see, very slow and kind of broken. Okay, so this one's taken a long time to pull up. It'll eventually come up, and then we'll start debugging about why it's so slow and why the requests are hanging. So I've set up this site over here. I don't have any rules set up quite yet. Basically, where I would be going for the rules is right here in the failed request tracing rules. And I'd be setting up there. There's a big on and off switch at the server level. So what you can do is you can actually set up your different rules, and then you can go up to the server level if you want to turn it off. You can just big off switch for the entire server, and then you can leave your rules there. And when you want to re-enable it, you just go back and you turn the on switch on at the server level, and then your individual application level rules get enabled. Oh. Okay. That is more broken than I thought. Okay, let me just check the config file real quick on this one. So I'm going to go and look at the config file and see if anything's there. I've been in and out of it a little bit, so I might have a problem with it there. Okay, default document. Yeah, that should be fine. Okay, so it is pretty broken. We did a lot of things to make it go slowly, so it just kind of timed out on that one. So, picture of Thomas up here on the mountains, IS-7. You see it right there. It's actually a pretty funny site. My favorite picture, actually, just to take a small digression, is Oktoberfest. I think it's funny, A, because now you see there's some images that are missing, right? And then we're also, we have pretty poor performance as well. This is Oktoberfest. Thomas is German. And so he had to take IIS to Oktoberfest. Okay, so here's our website. It's pretty slow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use WCAT, and I'm going to actually set up a stress test against it and just throw a bunch of client requests at it. And I'm going to do it for a while. I'm going to send, this is going to be a long-living request because I want to go back and show you the requests in flight and sort of demonstrate different ways to do that, and also demonstrate, once we set up the rules, what kind of data we're collecting against it. So I'm going to run the start stress long file, right, which is 5 worker threads, 20 client sessions a piece. And then I'm going to go back to IIS. Now, if you go to the top level and you look at worker processes, you see your default app pool there, and you can see all of the requests in flight. And it's really going to be showing you the requests that are going for more than 0 seconds running. So all the other requests are going really, really fast, except for a bunch of requests that seem to be in this SQL logging test module. Okay, so these are all the requests that are taking longer than 0 seconds. So I'm starting to get suspicious at this point. Now, you can do it through the IIS Manager UI, or you can actually go into my app command tool, which I have to find here. And you can do app command list requests, and it'll list all the requests in your command line, your command window as well. So again, same information. All the the SQL logging module seems to be generating longer-lived requests than any others. So that, of course, gets me all suspicious. And so what I would do at this point is I would say, okay, now I have a general sense of what's going on. Let's go and create some specific rules. So if you go to default website and you go down to your QDig site, you'll see that there's failed request tracing here. And I'm going to add a rule. I'm going to trace all content, but I'm going to really look for 404 errors in particular. And I'm going to make it pretty verbose. Okay? So at that point, I've just set up a rule. And as far as I know, let me just go back to my command window. I believe that the requests are still in flight. Yep, the requests are still going. So failed request tracing is now gathering data for me. It's gathering logs for me to take a look at. And that is when it gets really interesting. So I'm going to move over and take a look at some of those logs now, which are in this location. So it's inetpub logs, failed request log files, W3SVC1, right? You don't have to memorize that. It's up on our is.net website. And I'm going to take a look at the directory here. Okay. I don't know if I quite caught it in time. Okay, so I'm going to run that again. I'm going to run a shorter one, I think, which is just start stress. That's a 30-second module, just to make sure that my rules are working fine. One trick that you guys might run into is that it's very important for you to work on, when you're doing command line, it's got to be an elevated command prompt. Otherwise, you won't be able to look at your log files. If you just try to launch them directly in the browser, you'll get scripting errors. So if you look at some of the timestamps here, you can see that 4:57, that's my latest one, and I'm going to run it from here and just take a look at the file and walk you through what the information is. Oops. I think I missed a 0 or 2. FR002105.xml. Okay, where's my typo? Zero zero 2105. No, I mean, it should be launched through IE. That's what's weird about this. Okay, let's try that. All right, let me pick another one. All right, I'm going to start over on that one. All right, logs, cd failed request, log files, dir cd w3 svc1. Okay. 002110.xml. Okay. Don't understand that, but try it again. It works. Okay, so we have failed request files. So it basically loads up an IE, and this is what you see. So you have this summary, and the summary is very useful because basically it cuts to the chase, and it lets you expand all of the errors and warnings that that FREB found for you based on that specific rule that you set up. In this case, it's a problem in the SQL logging test file. And you can see the HTTP status is 404. It's been captured. And if you want more details, you can actually go here and you can look at all of the path through the request pipeline. So at every stage of the request pipeline, where did it succeed? Where did it fail? How long did it spend? And each particular phase of it. So it's a huge amount of information. A little bit later, I'll go over a demo where we go into these two areas. Here, there's no data because I haven't done a page trace and I haven't done any kind of system diagnostic integration. But really, the data that I'm looking for is here at the front level. Okay? And I see that, wow, it's taken a little bit of time here, and my problem is really in the SQL logging test module. Okay? So again, 50 of these files are created, okay? And then they start overwriting each other. So you can do a couple things. You can broaden, you can change that range, you can add more FREP files. It doesn't have to be just 50. But if you do very specific trace rules, right, then you won't just keep on churning out file after file after file and start overwriting some valuable information that you might have captured before. So now I figured out, okay, this SQL logging test module, maybe it's old, maybe it's trying to connect to a database from a while ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my modules. See, I've got my selection on QDig, and I'm going to go into modules, and I'm going to go ahead and just unload that particular module. So I just go down to Manage Modules, select that, and remove it. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to just check to make sure that that worked from a performance perspective. So let's take a look. Let's run the short one, the start stress.bat, and see if I have better performance from a multiple client perspective. I'm also going to just go ahead and just make sure everything works. Just going to start closing these. Okay. So here it's gone through after my 30 seconds of closing my windows. It's actually completed the test, and we've got about 71 requests per second. So, that's not as great as it could be, right? We can do better. IIS can do better than that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back in to IIS and actually change one setting around output caching. That's going to make the difference. So you can do this on an application level. You can do it on a server level. But I'm going to go into output caching, and I'm going to add output caching for my file extension, which in this case is PHP. And it's going to be kernel mode caching. I'm going to set it at time intervals, and then I'm going to see what that does from a performance perspective. Here's my website again. The nice thing about my website is none of my images are broken because the SQL logging folder was apparent, or the SQL logging module was doing something bad to my images as well. So everything works as expected. It's much faster. That was my previous one. All right, so it's still going through the test. See what kind of a difference it makes. Anyone want to take any bets? Any numbers? Throw out a number. It was 71 before.
1920.
Darn it. Yeah, you should have made a bet. It's Vegas. All right. So you can see I'm getting much better performance just by doing one thing. Just going in and changing to kernel mode caching for what we think of as semi-dynamic content. So how many people in the room understand what semi-dynamic content means? Okay. It's a really confusing, we use it all the time, but we never stop to explain it. So you guys all know what static content is. Dynamic content, or what we think of as really dynamic content, is content that gets served up as, say, shopping carts, for example. Very dynamic content. Semi-dynamic content is content that's dynamic, but it doesn't change based on URL, for example. Right? So query string parameter might change it, but it's not quite as dynamic as shopping carts, for example. So when we enable output caching, what we're doing there is we're really making it, we're pushing all that semi-dynamic content down into the kernel, and we're getting a huge increase in performance there. So in IS7, it's not just static content, but it's also semi-dynamic content that also gets cached. And you have some control over that, right? You can, make sure that the resource gets flushed if based on time or based on if the underlying resource actually changes. Okay. So I think you get the picture about the benefits for output caching.
Is that the same as the ASP.NET output caching, or is it different?
What's that?
Is that different or the same as the ASP.NET output caching?
It's different. So the question was, is our output caching different from ASP.NET output caching? And the answer is yes. We have a second.
With the classic ASP also?
Yes. Yes, there's no reason it wouldn't. You have to use a different extension, right? So you just have to register. I mean, it works with JPEGs. It works with all the different extensions.
You get PHP or any of the content to be, if it's authenticated request, or is that still the same behavior as 6?
No, it's still the same behavior as 6. It doesn't work with. Yes, that's a great point. So there's a difference between basic authentication, user mode caching, and kernel mode caching. In user mode caching, that's what you're going to do for basically any kind of content that has to be authenticated. But any other content that isn't authenticated, you can use kernel mode caching for that. It's a good distinction. Okay, so let's go back. Talk a little bit about application-specific diagnostics. So who in the room uses trace events or system diagnostics? A few folks? Okay. So what we've done in IIS is we've enabled you to get that same data integrated in that failed request tracing log file. Right? So it's basically taking another way of capturing data. It's putting it in a consolidated log file for you to look at as part of your diagnostic process. So let me just jump into a demo, and I can show you how that works. So I have a simple website here. It's basically, it's very simple. It's just going to generate a random number, and I'm using a trace call right here for it. And it has a module underneath it that basically uses system.diagnostics. And what I want to do is I want to keep track of the number of visits to each one of my URLs, and I want to trace the number of visits in a particular session. So I already have that set up, and what I want to do is I want to go and create a rule. So this is my demo site. So I go to my demo site, I go to failed request tracing rules, and I want to add a rule. And basically what I want to say is for all content, I want to look for anything that is successful. So any 200 status codes are success status codes. And then I'm going to hit the site again. I'm going to go find those log files again. Pub and filter request log files W3. Okay, and I've got a file that's been saved for me just now, so that should be the one that I want. Going to go ahead and launch. So I have a new randomly generated number. So you remember, again, the same failed request file, log file that you saw from before. It's obviously got no errors or warnings, right? Because I'm not tracing for an error in this case. I'm looking for success codes, and I just want to track some data that I want to use for my own reasons in my application code or for my debugging process. Where I want to go for this is in request details. So here I could expand all of it and look at the request trace, or I could go to ASP.NET traces, where you see all the events, the ASP.NET page traces that I just captured. Okay, so all the detail around your ASP.NET page trace is here, and your custom module trace is here. And I'm only capturing one thing, but it gives me the event data, and it also gives me the URI that I was working with. Okay? So really the goal here is to make sure that you can collect all the data. Again, going back to that best practice that we talked about earlier, it's getting as much data about the problem as you can. It's collecting it, and it's putting it in one place in this case so that you can use it to just streamline your diagnostic process. All right, so additional diagnostic tools, this concept of process orphaning. It's a pretty handy thing. The app pool settings, I don't know if you guys have ever played around with this. One of the performance recommendations that we make is actually to run 32-bit on 64-bit WoW. I don't know if you guys have heard about that recommendation from a performance perspective. Makes a big difference. And where you would do it is by configuring your app pools. So let's view our application pools. Here's our application pool. Here's my default application pool. If you go into here on advanced settings, a whole host of settings live in here. So I'm not going to see it on this machine because I have a 32-bit machine, but this is the dialog that you would use to set up 32-bit on 64-bit, 64 WoW for that performance increase. In this case, I'm not talking about setting up that particular setting. I want to set up process orphaning. It's by default false, and you want it to be false in a production environment. Okay? You only want to do this you only want to set it to true and attach a script for debugging to it if you are in a debugging mode as a developer. But it's a pretty handy piece of functionality. It was there in IS6, wasn't widely used, I believe, in IS6, but it's also here in IS7, and it is a pretty handy thing to think through. Rapid fail protection also occurs when you have and this is configurable when an app pool fails sometimes out of sometimes. If you go back into this demo, rapid fail protection is actually right here. And you can set up whatever your parameters you want to be. You can do it directly in the config file as well, but here's the UI for it. ETW tracing, a lot of people like it, right? So it's there if you need it. And we have log parser if you want to actually consume that data in a reliable way. RISCA is what I went and I showed you in the UI that looked at all the different requests in flight, greater than 1 second. It's pretty handy information. You can get at it through the user interface. You can get at it through app command utility as well. Debug Diag, this is something that our customer support folks use all the time. This is a tool that you can get, I think it might be in the resource kit for IS6, certainly available for download in the download center on is.net. And it's very handy for performance-related issues in particular. So I have a couple slides here that really focus on what you should do at different stages, okay? So while you're developing, use those request log files that I just showed you for failed request tracing to just look for patterns. Look for URLs or URIs that are coming up and showing errors. Process orphaning, like I said, if you can attach it to a debugger, pretty handy stuff. Use WCAT. Not enough people use WCAT. We run into this all the time. We work with customers, and one of the first things that we ask them when they say they're having scalability problems is we ask them, do you do performance testing or scale testing before you send it out? And they say no, and we say we have this free downloadable tool that you can use, and it's something that we use internally. We have an entire performance team on IIS, on the product team, and they use WCAT every day. as part of their stress testing for IIS, the web server. So really encourage you guys to check that out if you haven't checked it out yet. I forgot to add the link. Sorry, everyone. I have there's a performance tuning white paper that's out there. I have a blog up on IIS.net. I will go and add the link on the blog. Apologies for not having it here. But it's a performance tuning white paper that's for all of Windows Server 2008. And a lot of times when you're performance tuning, you got to look at the entire holistic picture. It's a pretty handy thing. It came out maybe 3 months ago, so it's pretty new too. I will put it in my blog. Apologies for not having the link here. All right. So when you're tuning, this is output caching for semi-dynamic pages, which are in fact a lot of pages. I mean, I think the truly dynamic pages are few and far between. A semi-dynamic page can be a page that is going to look up a stock, for example, where most of the page is pretty standard. It's making one query, right? That is a type of information that can be cached in kernel mode, and you can get the kind of improvements that we saw in the demo. I already talked about this. Set the IIS worker processes at 32-bit and 64-bit mode, WoW mode, on a per app pool basis. It makes an enormous difference, and there's no magic that we're doing there. IIS is doing very little there. It's basically just a question of being smart about how you use memory, and you're forcing it because you're working within 32-bit on a 64-bit WoW system. If you use script mapping in requests, just try using integrated pipeline. Run it in integrated mode, and try it with URL authorization. You're going to see big performance improvements. And probably my favorite one, because it's just so easy, is put your high traffic document on default documents and move it to the top of the list. So if I go back to IIS Manager, and if I look at default websites, and if I just go and I check out my default documents, I've got a list of default documents here. If I know that say, default ASP.x is going to be the most hit, I should move it up. Because basically what IIS does, especially if you have a lot of documents in the list, is that we're just going to go back down the list all the time. So if you know that you have a particular document that you're going to be hitting a lot, just move it to the top of the list. It's very easy, and it makes a pretty significant performance difference. So when you're troubleshooting, my number one thing is just use those failed request tracing. That's something you actually have to go out and set up. You have to set up the rules. You have to look at the log files. You get detailed errors for free. You just get them, right? Failed request tracing, you have to do a little bit of work to get set up, but once you have it set up, it's just on. And you have it there collecting data, and you can use it for those hard-to-repro errors. Keeping that log history valid and making sure you don't cycle through your 50 in your log, your 50 logs, and you lose your valuable data, that's another thing to keep in mind. So make sure that your rules are fine-grained enough to be specific, yet broad enough to kind of capture things. You'll have to play around with it a little bit. Don't use IIS reset. I know a lot of people do. It's kind of the hammer, right? Try to recycle your app pools instead. It'll basically give you the same effect without coming down like a ton of bricks on the web server. And I know people tend to do this a lot when they're troubleshooting, so I wanted to call it out here. And there's a lot of new performance counters that you can use when you're trying to check up on application health in general. So, I asked our performance team which ones they really care about when they look at performance counters, and they really called out the garbage collection related ones. So those are really important. Obviously, requests per second, things like that are very important. But look at the garbage collection performance counters as well for clues. All right, so, one of the things that I talked at the beginning about that modular architecture that we introduced in IIS 7, one of the things that it gives us on the product team the ability to do is to get new functionality out to you quicker, faster, and for all sorts of different scenarios. So how many folks saw the web playlist or the bitrate throttling demos earlier in the week? Okay, those were cool. I mean, that's great functionality. It's for very specific media integration scenarios, and they built that on the IIS module platform. We're running in, between 9 and 12-month release cycles with at least 1 or 2 betas in between. And our ability to sort of rapidly innovate like that is 100% based on this new modular architecture and the fact that you can just plug into the website. So look for a lot of this in the future. The thing that I always kind of call out is to send people to IIS.net, which is our community site. How many of you folks have been to IIS.net? Okay, everybody should go. Oh, see, I don't think I have internet. Nice. Okay, everybody should go to IIS.net. There's labs, there's webcasts, there's walkthroughs, there's blogs from team members, and the forums are incredibly valuable. Okay, so the forums are managed by the product team. Members of the team spend time every day going out and answering questions on the forums, and it's a really active community site. I've never worked on a team at Microsoft that cared as much about community and connecting with people daily through the website as I've met on this team. So really, I always encourage people to use it as a resource and also go and download some of these new features. The Secure FTP server, it's a new server. It's not a module. It's a new server built on the extensibility module. It's about a 2.5 year project for us. We had an entire team working on it. And it's a whole replacement and then some for FTP server that's in the box. We have a web dev component that's coming out in the next week, I think, Remote Manager, the Media Pack. We're working on all sorts of new tools that are going to be coming out and being downloaded from IIS.net. So a couple questions I always get when I talk about these IIS extensions is it fully supported by Microsoft? You guys aren't shipping in the box. You guys are shipping on the web. It's coming from a community site. There are ads on it. It doesn't look like TechNet, right? And yes, it is, all of the modules that the IIS team releases are 100% serviced and supported by Microsoft for the life cycle, the standard server life cycle, which is 7 years. Okay, so this is real software that has not only been tested by us and run through the security lifecycle and all the stuff we do internally at Microsoft, but it's also fully supported by PSS if you call in with an issue. So I talked a little bit about this. I want to mention it's free, the advice, right, and assistance in forums. And the Download Center, all the modules that we are providing are free, but they require Windows Server 2008. Okay, so all the stuff that I talked about around bitrate throttling and web playlists and secure FTP and WebDAV won't work on Windows Server 2003. And that is because it's built on the new platform. It's 100% on the new platform. What's that? You can download it on Vista, right, just to try it out, but it's not meant to work on Vista. I mean, we're not blocking, right? You can download it and look at it, but the EULA says, and we're really encouraging people to use them on servers and not in a dev environment. You can't. The reason why we don't block is because we recognize that developers will want to play around with it, right? Like, how many developers will go out and just check it out after Mix? They saw it in a keynote, download it, play around with it, see how it works, then go talk to the IT pro or the administrator, say, oh, this is kind of useful. That's a pretty common scenario for us. So we don't block, but it's licensed to work on server. So just to recap, and then I'll take questions, the new IIS 7 platform, it's a major release for us. We've got a lot of new functionality into it. I picked my favorites out of it, and I talked the most about the diagnostic tools. I think they're going to be a real time saver for you. I think especially failed request tracing and detailed errors are going to be very handy for developers and administrators alike. The thing I always like to do, too, is if you have any questions or comments, if there was something I said but I didn't go into any detail about, I've listed my email address, so just feel free to send me mail. I'd love to hear from you. I'm always looking for feedback on how you work with the server and what you think about it. Feel free to please fill out your session evaluations. I'd love to get feedback. Fill those out. Let me know how the talk went for you, and I will take questions now if anybody has them. Yeah, question.
We're actually deploying a bunch of servers now.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. Very nice. Can you come up to the microphone? I can't quite hear you.
We're actually in the process now of deploying a bunch of servers to a data center. And it's weird because Windows 08 kind of just first came out, and most people say don't deploy it until the first release comes out.
Yeah.
So my question is, one, are there any tools to allow us to transfer our IS6 type sites to this new development environment? And two, for people in like the hosting side of things, are there any supported tools to manage IS from a web host point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was really around migration. I mean, for a lot of you, Windows Server 2008 became available last week, or it was launched last week. It's a very common question. We actually have a tool that's a technical preview right now. It's up on is.net. We call it Web Deploy. And it's a command line utility that will migrate from IS6 to IS6 servers, IS6 to IS7, and IS7 to IS7 servers for web farm scenarios. And its goal is to migrate content. It's got a few things that it won't move around. It'll move most of the stuff around for you. It won't move COM+ objects, for example. There's a few things. You'll have to look in the documentation for what it won't move. But it will move, assemblies. It'll move the 80% case of your applications, and it does it in a very interesting way. First thing it does is it analyzes, right? So it'll analyze what you have, and it'll spit out a big log file. So if you don't want the magic of having the tool do the movement for you, you can just look at the results of the log file and do bits and pieces yourself. But if you want to do it, you can actually do the second step, which is called sync for us, and that does the synchronization between the source machine and the destination machine. It's a technical preview now. It's available. When you guys are going to is.net and you're doing downloads, look for the documentation link. And I'm very sorry I don't have an internet connection here. Look for the documentation link, because what RPMs do, and this is something that RPMs care a lot about, is they do walkthroughs. And I believe, this is Faith, who owns this feature, she did about 14 of these walkthroughs. And walkthroughs are step-by-step procedures for how to do a particular task. Okay? Really fundamentally valuable ways to get started. They're essentially mini labs on how to use the tool. So look for that. It's not included in the setup application, so I always like to call it out, but it is on that same download page, and it's called documentation. And we're looking to get that out in production. We have one beta out now. We'll probably do maybe one more we'll do one more beta, and then we'll go live with it. Question?
Yes. Are there any plans to integrate with PowerShell for management and troubleshooting?
Yeah, it's another great question. So, are there any plans to integrate with PowerShell? There is a tool called Microsoft Web Administration Object today. Right? And if you're going to do any kind of management of IIS and you're doing it from code, you're going to use MWA. It's an incredibly powerful thing. It's got a COM interface so it can be remoted too. So today you can use MWA in PowerShell just because it's a managed object, right? And you can get the reflection functionality from it. We are looking at building a PowerShell provider right now, and in fact, probably within the next 3 months, we'll have a technical preview of a PowerShell provider for the configuration system. So when you think about PowerShell, right, there's two things you can do with PowerShell. One is you can provide a whole set of commandlets. It's the exchange model. And the other thing that you can do is you can actually have a provider. And you want to do the provider if you own your data store. And we own our data store, which is a config system. So we build the provider, and then we hope people build a lot of commandlets for all their different scenarios on top of that. That's another module that we're releasing on the new platform. We'll have a technical preview out of it within 3 months. Yeah, another question?
One more question. You showed a scenario of the detailed error logging.
Right.
If it's a .NET 2 app and you disable debugging at the web config level, what kind of output would you get at that error screen?
I don't believe it has an impact on that.
Okay.
I mean, the error, it's just reading the HTTP error, and it's reacting to that. You wouldn't really see an impact. I mean, keep in mind that the detailed errors are not seen by customers, too. They're only seen on localhost.
I'm a bit confused. Like when you're writing an application and you have a database error or something and you don't trap that error, it'll throw an exception and show you the line of code that you normally get. So when you turn that off at the command line level, what would you get at that in that log file?
If it's not firing an HTTP error, you wouldn't see it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a separate thing entirely. I mean, that's just HTTP error codes.
Okay, so it's different.
Purely HTTP error codes.
Okay.
That's right. Any other questions? Can you say that again?
Is there an easy way to enable that tracing for range?
Yes, yes. The question was, is there an easy way to do tracing for a range of errors? And the answer is yes. You go to failed request tracing, and when you're setting up your rule, what you can do is you can do a range like in the example. You can say, 400 to 500, right? And then it'll capture that range. You can say 400 to 500, and then you can give a specific, say, 200 as well. So you can just concatenate, essentially. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, is there a way to monitor the cache or get a snapshot of what it was cached at a given time?
When it was cached or what is cached?
What is cached?
I believe there is a way to monitor what is cached, but I can't think of it right now. I believe there is a way to do that. If you look, there's a great article on is.net, and it's called Output Caching. Just do a search on is.net or any search engine for output caching on IIS 7, and it walks through all of those details. I can't remember the answer to that particular question, but I believe there is a way to do it. Yeah?
A situation where a person is doing remote administration of their site,
Mm-hmm.
connecting remotely to, say, the IS manager,
Yep.
they can turn on the reporting policy.
Yes. Yeah.
But they can't view it because they're not on the local host.
It's a little weird. Yeah. It's a little weird. No, so they can turn on failed request tracing, and they can see the logs, right? If they have remote access to the folder where the logs are stored, they can see the logs, but they don't have access. A remote developer will not have access to the detailed errors. So those are two separate features, right? You don't have access to detailed errors unless you have localhost. The IT administrator needs to make sure that the share that has all the log files is accessible to the remote developer. That's outside of IIS.
In a remote type of administration situation, and you, say, disable access to certain parts of the website administration,
Mm-hmm.
like what you're talking about,
Yep.
that or another part, do those tools still show up, or are they
Yep.
already out?
Yep, let me show you. So the question is, when you, it's around delegated administration, and it's when you delegate administration, what's the user experience for the developer, essentially. And I can't totally replicate it because I don't have a server on here, and it's a little bit different. I can't set up connections to my dev box. It doesn't make any sense in this mode. But what you can do is you can go at a top level, which is where you get your feature delegation over here, and you can set delegation for a specific site, right? In this case, I only have default website. Or you can set it at a server level. So let's just say that failed request tracing. Okay, so I'm gonna, right now it's read only, and I'm gonna make it, read write. Okay, and I have to do a little bit of work beforehand to set up the remote connection and set you up as a user. I'd have to do that on the server box. It won't work on a dev box. It's only a server scenario, right, to set you up as a remote user. But let's walk through this process because it would be very similar. So you'd set read write for request tracing rules, and then that would enable a remote developer to come in and be able to edit it. Let me just make it not read write. Let's make a read only because then you can see what you can't do, right? So right now, default document is read write. So let's make it read only. And this is going to do all feature delegation state for features at lower levels. So basically, if you go to my QDig site, and if I try to go and edit default document, oops, let's try over here. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to work on a dev box for me to run through this scenario. Okay, let me go back up here. I know. It's a little convoluted. So, I know I'm trying to replicate it, but it's not working because I'm already the developer. But basically what you'll do is if it's read-only, you'll still be able to see it, but there'll be a dialog or an error message on the right-hand column that says, this is read-only. You don't have permission to modify it. So it'll be grayed out, but it won't be missing. The information won't be missing. Any other questions? Yes?
What are all the reasons right now that it's installing the legacy IIS-6 console manual?
Yeah.
Is it just FTP or is there some other thing?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the question was, what is the reason to install all the legacy components? So when we did this new configuration system, we put the metabase in maintenance, right? And theoretically, you don't install these legacy components unless you have WMI scripts, right, that you had before and you need to have running or anything like that. There's a couple of things that pull through the legacy components. One of them is SMTP, unfortunately, because a lot of people enable SMTP on their servers. So if you're enabling SMTP, SMTP uses the metabase. Right now, Visual Studio 2007 uses the metabase. It won't in SP1, but today it does. So if you have Visual Studio on it, you need the metabase. So there's a bunch of, I think SQL also uses the metabase. SQL Setup uses the metabase. So you have a couple of applications that are still dependent on the metabase.
It's sort of a transition just
It is. It is, and it's going to take a while. I mean, it's one of our goals in the next server release to start this process of migrating partners. But when you're migrating other applications, they have to schedule the work, they have to do the compat testing and do this other stuff. So it is a process. But unfortunately, you will end up having the legacy components on your machine for scenarios you wouldn't really think of. All of our new components, so the web server itself, plus all of the new extensibility components, I'm getting the special signal to stop talking. Okay, all the new ones will not require legacy components. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll be down here, or actually outside, so the next speaker can come up if you have any other questions.